Well, hi guys. Welcome back. I know, 2 streams in one day. It's crazy. So, I am actually at my house right now, and nobody else is home. So, I figured might as well, I lied. My brother is home, and he's in his room. But, so, I don't want to offend him and say that he's no one. But, yeah. So, I decided to go ahead and knock out part 2 of this book, because I'm feeling productive today, apparently. So, we are in book 6 of the Enola Holmes. Hello, Riddy! Welcome back. Glad to have you. So just a recap in case you missed it earlier. We are in book 6 of the Enola Holmes mystery, which apparently in this book it says, solving crime runs in the family, which is new. It's not literally not written on any of the other books, but it's written on this one. So, we are reading, I'm reading, and you're listening. But, where we have left off is Enola just had this encounter. Well, first, a Duchessa has gone missing, and they don't know where she went. And in addition to that, Enola just had an encounter with a gypsy who knows her mother and may know where her mother is. But Enola has no idea where her mother is, and she didn't really help her out with any information. So where we last left off, Enola Holmes was taking the train to the Professional Women's Club to take some time and think. So that is where we left off. So we're just gonna go ahead and crack away, get going. We'll try and read through chapter 14, so which will be hopefully about a third of the book. So that's the plan. Hopefully I'll stream. It'll probably take me a little over an hour. So if you've got that time, thanks for being here. We'll go ahead and just get started. If you are listening and not able to chat, like, that's totally fine. Don't, feel like you have to. And I'll catch up with the chat in between chapters. So, talk to you guys in a bit. But, let's get going. Chapter the 8th. My room, like the exclusively few others in the third story of this sanctuary, was rather Spartan in its furnishings. This was, after all, a haven for intellectual women interested in dress reform and other freedoms, not likely to care whether the tables were draped or the bed wore a skirt. But the food, as I have said, was excellent. I ordered a plate of sandwiches to be brought to my room, and then, once bathed, I sat in my dressing gown devouring tuna paste, cucumber, and watercress, attempting to comfort both body and mind. I reminded myself that today was not the first time I had encountered someone who knew my mother. I had overheard her suffragist contemporaries speaking of her the first time I visited the club. I could not understand why my encounter with the gypsy woman had left me so flummoxed, and, as is my custom, when such is the case, I turned to paper and pencil. Swiftly I sketched picture after picture. I drew the gypsy woman's face. The intensity of her cat-like gaze almost frightened me. I drew a raven in flight, certainly not riding on my shoulder. In olden times, speaking ravens accompanied soothsayers, but also the blackbirds flocked to battlefields, waiting to feed on death. I drew the ill-tempered Tosher in the underground tunnel, caricaturing his strawberry nose and cauliflower ears as revenge for the scare he had given me. I tried to draw the gypsy woman again, but found her turning into Mum. This was most disconcerting, as I could not normally call my mother's features clearly to mind. Seeing them emerge hurt my heart. Turning that sketch face down, I tried another, drawing a delicate, lovely lady, fair-haired and slender, with the most exquisitely sensitive eyes. She soothed my feelings so that I was drawing her again from a different angle before I realized she was Blanchefleur, Duchessa del Campo. Oh, for heaven's sake, there I sat. I'd be drawing horses next, eating fish paste sandwiches when I should be finding out what had happened to her. Shoving all other thoughts aside along with my sketches, I set to work, attempting to reason out on paper what might have become of Lady Blanchefleur. Either she has disappeared of her own free will, or she has met with accident or foul play. If her own will, how did she hide from searching ladies-in-waiting? Down track? Most unlikely, but must be investigated. Must learn more about Lady's background unhappiness. Must learn more about Lady's background. Unhappiness? Her letter to her mum, not cheerful. If accident or foul play? Accident. She fell through a grating into a sewer, broke her leg so she cannot climb out, and no one can hear her screams? Unspeakably melodramatic. Foul play. She has been taken by force. For ransom. But no demand has been received. For some other purpose? Revenge? Who is her enemy? Again, inquire into Lady's background. Perhaps the entire subway story is a fiction concocted by the ladies-in-waiting? But surely the emotion I had observed in them was genuine. I did not believe that last sentence for a moment, and none of my other jottings felt particularly insightful either. In such cases, one quite needs to cease thinking for an hour or two, thereby letting the mind alone to do its work. But how to distract myself meanwhile? Visit Mrs. Tupper, of course. It had been several days. My dear, deaf, former landlady would be delighted to see me, and the venture was always quite a diversion. At once I arose from my chair to prepare. Mrs. Tupper, I must explain, was now a guest in residence at the amazingly populous house of Florence Nightingale. Unfortunately, my brother Sherlock knew this, surely deduced that I visited her, and I believe kept watch for me. The street urchins I often saw hanging about might well have been his Baker Street irregulars. However, he would have described me to them as a studious or spinsterish female in tweed or some other drab, dark garb, with mud-brown hair yanked back in a bun and an alarming nose disguised by spectacles. Such being the case, whenever I visited Mrs. Tupper for the sake of my own safety, I went as an exquisitely lovely lady. I will spare the gentle reader the rigors of the facial emollients and tinctures necessary to effect this transformation, except to mention that, as usual, I affixed a small birthmark to my temple to draw attention away from the center of my face, that is to say, my proboscis, the prominence of which was further diminished by my full, luxurious, and quite expensive, chestnut-colored wig. But I cannot deny myself a description of the afternoon calling costume I wore that day, a heavenly confection of cerulean blue dotted Swiss gathered into scallops over a skirt of midnight blue, with a wide white satin belt, a blue bodice trimmed in white, a dainty blue hat topped with daisies and ribbons, and a blue and white parasol ruffled with dotted Swiss. In fawn gloves and gaiters, I looked, as if to say it myself, rather a dream. Indeed, I took a hansom cab to Mayfair, so that I might enjoy, whilst pretending not to notice, the admiring glances of the populace. Never has a fair lady felt less presentiment of impending doom. Alighting from my cab in front of Florence Nightingale's handsome brick house, I turned to pay the cabby. Nearly, and closing in on me, I heard the most astonishing, almost human cries of joy. The next moment, furry feet nearly bowled me over. Furry feet nearly bowled me over. As I turned to see what had jumped upon me, time played the most peculiar trick. Rather like an accordion with all the air pumped out of it, I might as well have been a child again, so instantly I embraced my beloved dog. Reginald! Without a thought for my dress, for appearances, onlookers, or anything else except Reginald Collie, I sat right down on the pavement to hug him in both arms, laughing and weeping as he waggled and licked my face and cried canine yops of joy. Bliss. For brief, ecstatic moments. Then a pair of long, slender, but strong hands came down, clipping a leash to Reginald's collar, and I looked up into the carefully expressionless face of my brother Sherlock. But I refused to let go of my happiness. Still laughing, I extended a hand to him and let him help me to my feet. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," I burbled in dulcet tones an octave higher than my normal speaking voice. "Oh, just wait until I tell my aunt that I have met the famous Sherlock Holmes." Astonishment trumped control. His jaw fairly dropped for a moment before he disciplined it. That was you in Watson's parlor? Studying the bizarre bouquet his enemy had sent him? Yes. Oh, excuse me, I think that was Enola talking. Studying the bizarre bouquet his enemy had sent him, yes. Still caressing Reginald with one hand, brushing dog hair from my dress with the other, I challenged Sherlock. Now confess, you would never have known me if it were not for our furry old friend here. I admit you are quite right. I am utterly taken aback. I do hope that the wedding ring I feel beneath your glove is merely part of your disguise? Quite so. Then you remain unmarried, and, it is fervidly to be hoped, virginal? My dear brother, I protested with some asperity. Forgive me. Of course I should not ask, but I am all confusion. Even I, seldom an admirer of the fair sex, can see that you are quite lovely. I felt heat in my face, and I could not speak, struggling not to smile with too much pride. Sherlock went on. It would appear that finishing school is unnecessary. My expression must have changed, frozen, for he hastened to add, I no longer have any intention of coercing you into such an establishment, my dear sister, I assure you. Miss Nightingale has enlightened me regarding the, disadvantages of young ladies' boarding schools. How good of her! But has she enlightened Mycroft? For my elder and exceedingly stubborn brother was the one who held legal power over me. Sherlock's glance shifted sidewards, confirming my suspicion. I was not yet out of danger. I must get away, at the earliest opportunity. The thought wrenched my heart, for I quite adored the stimulating company of my brother Sherlock. In his most crisp tones he said, My reason for finding you in this irritatingly simple manner, I should have thought of it a year ago, has nothing to do with Mycroft. Something has happened? Quite an odd something. There has been a most peculiar communication from our mother. That's the end of chapter 8. Well, hello, Terror. Thank you. Thanks for being here and lurking. Welcome for lurking. I know, in tweed. Can you imagine? One of my favorite descriptions I've seen. He was a tweedy sort of man in a tweedy sort of coat and a tweedy sort of hat. Like a Tweety bird. That's what it sounds like to me. Thank you for clapping. Thank you, Dr. Terror. Thanks for being here. I'm glad you can be here. Even if you're lurking, it's appreciated. And I think I see Summer lurking there too. So thank you guys for being here. Gonna keep on trucking. Sorry. Water didn't want to go down or something. Chapter the 9th. Mum! Then she is alive? I exclaimed, my thoughtless response revealing the fear I had scarcely acknowledged to myself. Because I had not heard from her in so many months, she might be no longer with us. Not that she had ever been with us, exactly. What had the gypsy woman said about an arrow shot into the sky, an owl flying in the moonless night? Mum rode with the caravan of many beautiful horses, black starred with white. Might this have been a poetic way to say that she had passed on, expired, crossed over? I detested the conventional euphemisms, yet found myself taking refuge in them. My brother's face assumed the superior look of a logician. Because you have not heard from her in several months, you have thought that she might be deceased? My dear sister, I did not hear from her in years, yet remained assured she was very much alive. Yes, because you knew she was cadging money from Mycroft. Here's another SAT word for you guys. Make sure I spell it right. Cadging. I retorted a bit tartly, masking the tremulous feelings brought on by my paramount thought. How odd. My encounter with the gypsy only a few hours ago. But I said nothing of this to Sherlock. It was not a matter he could investigate with deductive reasoning. Instead, I demanded, a peculiar communication? How so? Peculiar in what way? I shall show you, and let you draw your own conclusions. He turned as if expecting me to follow. At least tell me, what does it say? I cried. I cannot. I have not opened it. It is addressed to you. I could have screamed, my impatience shot to such a fever heat. Is this one of your callous schemes to ensnare me? Enola! As he looked over his shoulder at me, I glimpsed emotion in his face, quickly suppressed. No, I wouldn't dare, he responded dryly. But we ought to go sit down. He inclined his head towards Florence Nightingale's house, where the front door literally stood open, as if it were a public building with reformers, government officials, and sundry other visitors coming and going at will, although the famous nursing reformer kept herself a strict recluse in the topmost story. Surely you can trust me so far. The truth, to my dismay, was that I would have trusted him a great deal further. So into the massive brick house on South Street we went, unannounced and utterly unnoticed. In no other upper-class residence in London, I am certain, would it have been possible for a tall man in a top hat, leading a scruffy dog and carrying a valise, to simply walk in. Especially when accompanied by a willowy young woman with her hat knocked askew and paw prints all over her dainty dress. Because the ground floor was crowded, apparently there was a meeting taking place, I saw a great many red Salvation Army jackets. The three of us, counting Reginald Colley, made our way upstairs to the music room, where Mrs. Tupper customarily spent her days, lest someone play the piano, a great joy to her, as even her deaf ears could hear the music if she sat directly behind the instrument. "Miss Michelle!" she cried the instant I entered. To her I would always be Miss Michelle, former boarder and recent rescuer, no matter how little I looked like that wow. I know this word, I just can't pronounce it right now. Pseudonymous person. I know what it means. I just can't say it right now. My disguises never deceived her, for she had seen them all. Tottering up from her rocking chair, she hugged me around the waist, and I laid my cheek atop her starched white house cap, which barely reached my shoulder. Meanwhile, Sherlock brought 2 other chairs over, and we all sat down. There was no need to make polite conversation to Mrs. Tupper. Indeed, she directed all her attention to Reginald Colley, patting his head with both shaky hands and exclaiming, "What a darling, good old-fashioned farm collie, the way a collie ought to be, not one of them needle-nosed, spider-legged things you see in Hyde Park." Meanwhile, Sherlock laid his valise across his knees, opened it, and withdrew from it a large, flat packet made of brown paper, which he passed to me. Some unknown person left this at the kitchen door of Ferndale in the middle of the night. Staring at the primitive charcoal renditions of stars, eyes, owls, arrows, snakes, moon, and sun, I told him with a great certainty. A gypsy put it there. I had seen just such designs very recently on the amulets of a certain gypsy. I had also seen designs many times before painted on their colorful wagons. A gypsy? What makes you say so? Why, she has been roaming with them ever since— The expression on his face reminded me. Oh dear, I forgot you didn't know. How on earth do you know? I guessed, and then I asked her in the newspaper. She replied in the affirmative. Would you be referring to that confounded nonsense about the 4th letter of true love? Forget-me-not, I explained. The 4th letter is G. The flower for purity is the lily, the 4th letter Y. For thoughts it is the pansy, 1st letter P, and so on. He shook his head, as if no less bewildered than before. What would Mother want with a band of stinking, thieving gypsies? Freedom. But such wheedling beggars! Bright caravans and beautiful horses, nights under the stars, no boundaries, the world's oldest nomadic people playing the world's most exquisite violin music, and no need to dress for dinner ever again. Stewed rabbit, he groaned, still shaking his head, not so much in negotiation as inability to believe. In a tin pot over a smoky, sooty fire. Paying no attention to him, I studied the brown paper, not so much the chrysanthemum and ivy as at its center, although the sight of that unmistakably familiar artwork squeezed my heart. But what puzzled me was the dark, ominous charcoal symbols all around, especially the 4 evil eyes, for that is what most folk would call them, in the corners. To me they seemed not so much frightening as frightened. Gypsies are superstitious folk, I remarked to Sherlock as casually as if I had not undergone the superstitious practice of palmistry with the yellow-eyed gypsy a few hours before. I still did not know what to think of her. These markings are just such lucky charms as they work into their copper amulets, but why have they scrawled them all over this packet? If you would open it, he grumbled, some reason might come to light. What's that? Exclaimed Mrs. Tupper as she noticed the package for the first time. We shall see. Although I usually open envelopes with my fingers, I thought I ought not tear this one. I suppose I ought to use a knife. That's the end of chapter 9. Ask for or obtain something to which one is not strictly entitled. Makes sense. Good old Webster. Words are hard, I'm telling you. Thank you for clapping. Excuse me, I'm getting a text message from my other brother. Alrighty. Yep, I know. Thank you. I will tell him you said hello, Rudy. Alrighty. I'm just gonna keep on going, guys. You just keep on listening. Chapter the 10th. Sherlock started fumbling in his pockets for a penknife, but I simply drew my dagger from my bosom, from its sheath in the busk of my corset. Of course. How silly of me not to remember, said Sherlock in owlish tones. Paying no attention, I slit the end of the thin parcel. Pressing against its corner so that it opened rather like a mouth, I peered inside. I could see nothing except what seemed to be a muddle of shredded packing paper. This I shook out, depositing it in my lap. What in Evan's name? Chirped Mrs. Tupper. Might you ever so kindly sheathe Excalibur, Enola? Sherlock suggested mildly. I did so, scarcely noticing his jesting name for my dagger, as I studied the mass of white paper in my lap. In a strip, or perhaps more than one strip, about an inch wide, it was partially covered on one side with blue ink, fragments of my mother's flyaway handwriting. I knew at once what it was, but Sherlock said it first. A sky tale. Such, I find to my astonishment as I write this, is the proper spelling of the word, evidently with its roots in Greek. I had always, since I was a child, thought of it as a skit-alley, for that is the way it is said. Mum and I had played at skit-alley whilst I was learning to write. It was quite fun. One takes paper, cuts it into even strips, pastes them end to end, winds them around some cylindrical object, writes one's message lengthwise down the cylinder, then unwinds the paper. One's message, now all in bits and pieces on the long strip of paper, cannot be read by its recipient, Mum, until she finds the right size of cylinder to wind it around, whether broomstick, rolling pin, brass bedpost, lampstand. Possibilities at Ferndale were manifold, but finite. But what were the possibilities in London? Nearly infinite. I would not be able to read Mum's letter until I had found a cylinder of the proper size to wind it round, and my frustration drove me so nearly to tears that I had to bite my lip. This was what I had been longing for since the day Mum went away. A letter, some words of explanation, perhaps affection, perhaps even, dare I think it, love. I must contact Lane at once, declared Sherlock in decisive man-of-action tones, to find out whether there were gypsies in the vicinity the night this packet was surreptitiously delivered, and if there were, I must make haste to track them down. Oh, nonsense, I cried with vehemence that surprised me, springing as it did from jealousy I had not yet acknowledged. But there it was. This was my packet, and I ought to be the one to find Mum. Mother has always taken quite good care of herself. Hadn't you better direct your energies toward finding the Duchessa del Campo? I told him rather viciously. He had started to rise to his feet, but mention of that name folded him back into his chair. He stared at me for several moments. Pray do not tell me, he said finally, that you came down the stairs and passed behind me at the Duque del Campo's foyer this morning, whilst I was distracted by the most peculiar behavior of a cat? Certainly I will not tell you so, I replied sweetly. I'll tell you only that the Duchessa Blanchefleur is a lady who truly requires rescue, unless she has chosen a most unlikely way to leave of her own free will. I seized upon the opportunity to learn more about the missing person's background. Have you contacted her mother and father, or made inquiries regarding any discord between her and her husband? Of course I have. By all accounts, the Earl of Chipley-on-Wye and his lady wife are scrupulously genteel and without pretensions. While quite naturally they approve of their daughter's exalted marriage, certainly they did not arrange it or force it. By all accounts, the Duque won his bride via the old-fashioned courtship, and has proved to be an exceptionally loving husband, and young Blanchefleur has every reason to consider herself a lucky woman. His dismissive tone rather starched my spine as I thought of the letter I had seen upon Blanchefleur's desk, and her melancholy, her restlessness. Yet I had seen no signs of preparations to run away. Also, surely she would not choose to disappear in such an odd and uncomfortable manner. Quelling my irritation, I spoke to my brother levelly enough. I find it unreasonable to think that her disappearance from the Baker Street Underground was not voluntary. Moreover, there can be only one way it was done. She must have been taken down the underground track in one direction or the other. If her ladies-in-waiting are telling the truth. I am convinced they are. You did not see their red eyes all puffed with weeping. And you did. I refrained from answering. Are you suggesting that I go search the tracks? The London Constabulary has already done so. And did they find no ways that toshers, tramps, and the like might use to make their way down the Thames? Old riverbeds, for instance? Certainly they saw such rat-holes aplenty. To investigate each is impossible. If the lady was taken into captivity by such a route, there is nothing we can do except wait for a ransom demand. Nonsense. You can find the old woman who lured her into the underground. A toothless toad of a crone with bristles on her chin and a flaring, old-fashioned bonnet. Why did I seem to recognize... But as my mind cast a flickering image like something from a magic lantern, my speech continued. I do not think Duchessa Blanchefleur was kidnapped for ransom. If such were the case, then surely a demand would have been received by this time. There are other reasons that villains might seize her. The old woman might have been a procuress. Enola! He actually paled, so aghast was he to hear such a word from my lips. As I had only the vaguest idea what a procuress procured, or for what purpose, in the merest spirit of argument, I plunged on. Or she might have been taken for the sake of her clothing. I suppose I ought to explain that there was a great trade in stolen clothing in the East End, and there had actually been a few shocking cases of upper-class children actually being abducted as they crossed the street to play with a neighborhood child, then turning up bawling and mostly naked, in a very different area than whence they came. For this reason, few such children were allowed upon the street without the accompaniment of a guardian servant. For her clothing? The Duchessa is not a child! To the contrary, I thought she seemed quite childlike in many ways, but Sherlock laughed heartily. Most far-fetched. However, had anything of the sort happened, she should have been home again within the day. I did not answer. Indeed, I scarcely listened, for at that moment I remembered where I had seen, indeed, had known quite well for a few evil days, an old woman with a bristly chin and a hideous bonnet. Without a word, I gathered the papers from my lap, jumped up, hugged Mrs. Tupper, gave Reginald Colley one last pat on the head, and, abandoning my gloves and parasol, ran towards the stairs. "Enola!" I heard Sherlock shout in quite a wrought tone from behind me. Stuffing the Skytail, into my bosom. "I shall send word!" I called over my shoulder as I darted downstairs, out of the house, and ran for all I was worth, hearing Sherlock's footfalls closing in behind me. But the instant I reached the street, I whistled shrilly, in a most unfeminine manner, and a passing cab pulled up short. I leapt in, and thumped on the roof, signaling the cabby to drive on. As it was, of course, a hansom cab, I sat in full view of my brother as it trotted away. Indeed, I looked over my shoulder to see him about 20 feet behind me, breathing hard and looking fulminous. He would be after me directly. I needed a hiding place, but I also urgently needed to reach the East End. Desperately, I needed to disguise myself, as I had never disguised myself before. That's the end of chapter 10. Thank you. Oh, sorry. I realized you already clapped for chapter 9, and I was thanking you because I thought you were way ahead of the game and clapping for this chapter. And now you're clapping for this chapter. Thank you. All right. Thank you guys very much. 11, 12, 13, 14. So we'll get about 4 more chapters in. Way ahead of the game. I know. You guys are pros at this. Chapter the 11th. "Where to, milady?" inquired the cabby, through the sliding panel in the roof. You see, the hansom cab, or more properly, hansom with a capital H, having been invented by Mr. Handsome, some years ago, quite cleverly put the cabby at the top and back of the vehicle, providing passengers with a view of their surroundings, rather than a much less attractive study of the driver's posterior. Hence the open-air vehicle's popularity on pleasant days. Perched high above the ground, the handsome cab driver controlled the horse by reins passing through rings on the top of the carriage, and as for the flaps that admitted fares and protected their legs, he operated them with a lever and communicated with passengers from on high. Indeed, I had never seen a hansom cab driver get up or down. Oh, my brilliant stars! Like most of my more daring or harebrained ideas, it all came to me within a moment. The driver had no sooner asked his question than I answered, "To your stable." "Beg pardon?" His voice went a bit squeaky. "To wherever it may be that you house your horse and cab." I presented him with a pound note through the slot in the roof. "Do not fear, I shall make it worth your while." Not until we reached the ubiquitous Serpentine Mews did the possible obstacles to my plan occur to me. If my man worked for one of the large cab companies, how could I expect to be successful, and how many more people would I need to bribe? I could not think. All seemed hopelessly muddled. I sensed the invisible weight of the gypsy woman's raven on my shoulder. I had angered Sherlock again. The message from Mum writing in my bosom felt, in my mind, as if it were actually burning its way into my heart. Yet everything else must wait until I had found the Duchessa del Campo. Indeed, I felt guiltily fortunate that I had such an excellent excuse for procrastination, because even in this short length of time, my feelings about my mother's missive had changed. No longer on fire to read it at once, instead I wanted to wait a while longer, to allow myself more time to hope that the message might contain some word of motherly feeling or affection towards me. Without quite allowing my mind to shape the thought into words, I sensed that this might be my last chance. I would be devastated if disappointed. Therefore, I had become a bit cowardly, willing to put off the moment of truth. Meanwhile, my cabby passed through the Serpentine Mews, turned a couple of corners, and pulled into a small stable at the back of an exceedingly modest house. "Good. You're independent, then," I stated without preamble as I let myself out. "'At's right." No overseer to interfere, how fortuitous. The man still sat on his high perch. "Come down, my good fellow," I told him. Recklessly, I lifted both my hat and my wig from my head, tossing them aside into a bale of straw. He quite gasped, but I was not to be distracted by his feelings. "How much do you usually earn in a day?" Standing before me now, he opened and closed his mouth in a fish-like manner several times before he managed to say, "On a good day, £3. "I will give you 10 for today's use of your horse, your cab, and the loan of your hat and jacket." Although I had always vowed I would never dress as a male, I comforted myself by deciding that technically I was not doing so, and that I would not wear trousers. My lower portion need never be seen. The driver's seat had little doors that closed in it like a bucket. "Here you are." I placed a £10 note in the startled man's hand. It was not that simple, of course. My cabby required several minutes of persuasion, not financial, though I would gladly have given him more. But honest fellow that he was, he worried that I wanted his cab for nefarious purposes. I assured him over and over again that my intentions were neither immoral nor illegal, that I would be careful, that I would have his horse and hansom safely back to him by nightfall. My intentions, actually, were simply to feel blessedly certain that Sherlock Holmes, even with the aid of Reginald Colley, could no longer lay his hands on me as I performed a very necessary errand. Journeying to the East End of London, where I hoped to find the toad-like old woman with the bristly chin who had lured the Duchessa del Campo into the underground. She was, as I felt, most certain, Mrs. Culhane of Culhane's Used Clothing. It so happened that I was rather unpleasantly acquainted with this interesting person from an earlier adventure. Indeed, from the train that had initially brought me to London, on which occasion she had worn a hideous bonnet. And although London might contain hundreds, perhaps thousands of ugly old women in old headgear that flared like fungi, how many of them dealt in used clothing? Moreover, I knew Mrs. Culhane's ruthlessness and daring, and felt instinctively certain that it was she who had waylaid the Duchessa del Campo, although she could not have done the entire dastardly deed by herself. I knew the sort of friends she had, and I felt sure a couple of thugs had waited for her in the Baker Street Underground station, although I had not the sketchiest plan at this point of how to confront Mrs. Culhane. Still, there was a great deal of earnest truth in my tone as I told the cabby that I wanted to use his hansom for an errand of mercy. He rolled his eyes but gave in. "It's right. It's a right fool I am, but very well then. If you'll do this one thing, set down me name and 'ouse number on a paper and put it in the cab, so's so's it'll get back to me in case of mischance. Willingly I complied, producing paper and pencil from my bosom to write down his name and address. Your name, missus? He asked. A most fortunate reminder for me to yank off my wedding band and toss it into the hollow of my wig. As for the good man's question, rather giddily I replied, Oh, merciful heavens, I can't even remember at the moment. I have so many. And somehow this unguarded, if quite irregular response satisfied him concerning me. He shrugged, almost smiling. He waited discreetly as I grimed my face a bit by way of disguise, hid my hair, which was already secured atop my head, under his bowler hat, and covered my bodice, which was luckily rather low-necked, with his jacket. He assisted me, I allowed the gentlemanly gesture, although I required no help, as I climbed up to the driver's seat and closed its doors to hide my skirt. He handed me the whip and reins, led the horse out of the stable for me. Take care. Said, take care, and then I was off, clattering down the streets of London. That's the end of chapter 11. Oh, have fun lurking, Summer. Have fun. It's going to keep on going. Chapter the 12th. As I had only the most rudimentary notion of how to use the reins, I will admit I felt a bit terrified atop the hansom cab. Certainly I am not afraid of heights, climbing trees for instance, but this high perch moved. Moreover, it moved in close proximity to many other large moving objects. I found myself jostling with vehicles of every description, carriages and carts, cabs and wagons, some light and fast, some heavy and slow, some going one way, some the other, trying to pass each other sometimes so closely that their wheels nearly scraped, or the shafts all but locked. Sometimes they do lock, and then there is usually a ruckus, if not a fist fight. Blessedly I avoided such a fate. My cab horse, appropriately named Brownie, knew his business, trotting along sedately and keeping me out of trouble. Cab! shrilled strident female voices in unison from two of the most grandiosely begowned, bejeweled, massively bonneted, and great-bosomed dowagers ever seen upon a London avenue. Although I startled to recognize them, I at once shook my head as if I were commissioned to pick up a fare elsewhere, trotting on. Once past them in afterthought, I wished I had managed to splash some gutter slop on them. They were Lady Cecily's termagant aunts, who with the connivance? Here's an SAT word for you guys. Connivance? I don't know how it's pronounced. Of Cecily's father, had imprisoned and starved her, attempting a forced marriage. Cecily was now safe with her loving mother, and maybe someday I would encounter her again. The thought cheered me so that I smiled as I drove on, although I did not know how I was going to accomplish what I needed to do today. Somehow I had to enter Mrs. Culhane's shop and have a look about. If she were to recognize me, there could be the most unpleasant, even life-threatening repercussions. But I tucked the problem into the back of my mind as I trotted on, trusting my peculiar mental processes to deal with it along the way. As I reached the edge of London City and passed into poorer district, the carts and baskets of street vendors lined the narrow thoroughfares, sending up the most tempting aromas. Stopping my cab, I bought a meat pie from a pie man by pointing with my whip, flipping him 2p as he wrapped my luncheon in brown paper and hefted it up for me to catch. All around me, workmen and urchins, shopgirls and washerwomen, crowded the cobbles. Nearby, a beggar had attracted a crowd by exhibiting a tame tortoise that would stand on its hind legs for the sake of a treat, stretching higher and more erect until it fell over backwards upon its own shell, oscillating like a rocking horse to the great amusement of all. Eating my meat pie and watching from on high, I laughed as hard as anyone, shaking my head in wonder as I threw a penny. One never knew what one was going to see on an East London street. Whether ginger cake sellers or a dancing bear, a woman hawking buttons and bootlaces, or the most outrageous beggars. Why, back at the edge of the city I had seen a beggar with matches, who had brazenly positioned himself right next to a vendor of cigars, the reeking things. How males could possibly enjoy such an acrid pleasure was beyond my comprehension, although a few daring and notorious women... Wait. actresses mostly, but occasionally one saw... Could I possibly? Oh my. If I were to try... I thought I could manage it, especially if I tucked up my dotted Swiss overskirt to hide it under my jacket. Would my appearance then have the desired effect upon Mrs. Culhane? Almost certainly. Very well, I would do it. Standing up in my high perch, I undertook the necessary maneuvers to hide my dotted Swiss, paying no attention to the exclamations and stares of a number of doubly astonished East Enders. Not only was I, the cabby, female, but partially disrobing in public. It didn't matter, none of these people would ever see me again. After sitting down, concealed again, ignoring shouts, laughter, and a few catcalls, I addressed all my scant skill with the reins to turning the horse around. Then, back I went to purchase a cigar, and some matches. I lit the cigar, but wedged the stinking thing between the cab and its carriage lamp, to burn as I once again turned the ever-patient brownie eastward. By the time I reached the corner of St. Tooking's Lane and Kipple Street, the cigar had burned halfway down and extinguished itself. To my relief, for I had no idea how to actually smoke one, nor did I wish to learn. My purpose, rather, was to feign. I stuck the cigar in the corner of my mouth, clenching its unburnt end between my teeth with what I hoped was a most unpleasant grin. Halting the cab in front of Mrs. Culhane's shop, I attracted the attention of a crowd of fishwives and street urchins, as hardly ever a cab came into this street. Their interest greatly increased as I now got down. Gasps and murmurs arose as my skirt, now plain dark blue, came into view. Although not common, and much disapproved for flouting the rules of feminine dress and appearance, billy women were sometimes to be seen in London, generally with a bulldog on a leash. Lacking one of those, I glowered, brandishing my whip as I hitched the cab horse to a lamp-post. Then, with whip still in hand, I strode into Mrs. Culhane's shop. There she was, her personage shaped rather like that of the beggar's turtle standing on its hind feet, her demeanor more similar to that of an outraged hedgehog. Although I took care not to look at her directly, I could see her chin bristles quivering, her stubby hands fumbling in the air, and I devoutly hoped that in her shock she would not see past my hat, my cigar, and my sneer to my actual face, or self, which she might recognize. Striding past her as quickly as possible, I made for the back of the shop, raking its contents with my glance, and yes, prominently displayed was Duchessa Blanchefleur's silk moire dress, or I think it's Mar, I think Rudy looked it up. Dress with a matching parasol, plus many luxurious petticoats, and a long, expensively brocaded spooned corset that might well have belonged to that same unfortunate lady. But now what? Confound it! There was no way I could safely question Mrs. Culhane, and most unlikely that any information could be pried from her toothless mouth in any event. Better to leave the dress and parasol here until the police could see them. But I wanted something to prove my case. A handkerchief? Hadn't the two Marys said that their mistress carried a handkerchief? I made for the basket where ladies' handkerchiefs lay in display, rifled through them, seized upon one I thought I recognized, and examined it. Yes. In the corner, although the red and golden thread had been picked out, the impression of close stitching still plainly showed upon the fabric. D.D.C. Duchessa del Campo. Handkerchief in hand, defiantly tossing a shilling onto the shop floor, I exited. It amused me as I resumed my perch atop my cab to glimpse Mrs. Culhane down on her hands and knees hunting for the money as I drove away. Her greed was greater than her moral outrage, apparently. Once around the next corner, gladly I tossed the cigar into the street and took a deep breath of relief. Yet I suddenly felt bone weary. Yes, I had got the handkerchief safely in the pocket of my borrowed jacket, and yes, it gave proof to my theory of what had happened to the Duchessa Blanchefleur. Having been robbed of her clothing, she remained in the East End for some unknown reason. Illness, prostration, lack of resources, restraint by some unknown villain? So far so good, but now what? Wondering whether I should notify Scotland Yard or take my suspicions first to the Duque, I drove back towards the West End to return Brownie and the hansom cab to their owner. As I entered the city with its teeming traffic, soon my pace necessarily slowed to a walk, and then I found myself standing still, in a block-up that seemed likely to last for minutes. Setting the whip in its socket, sighing, just as for something to do, I pulled the Duchessa's handkerchief out of my pocket. And looking at it in the full light of day, rather than in Mrs. Culhane's dim shop, I saw something that had escaped my notice before. It was perhaps the most disgusting good luck I'd ever experienced. Although she had taken care to remove the monogram, it would appear that Mrs. Culhane had not troubled herself to launder the handkerchief, for in its center, quite clearly, one could see signs that it had been applied to someone's nose. I recalled what one of the Marys in waiting had said about Duchessa Blanchefleur's asthma. Could it possibly be that I held in my grasp the nasal detritus of the missing noblewoman? Although hardly a delicate notion, it seemed quite likely. Even as I thrust the handkerchief back into my pocket in haste and distaste, nevertheless the thought struck me. Might the scent of the unfortunate Duchessa yet remain upon the handkerchief? If so, might it, blessedly, not be necessary for me to search the tracks of Baker Street's underground, or other areas of London's nether cesspool? Perhaps not. Indeed, I admit the idea occurred due to recent events instigated by Sherlock. Might it be possible for a dog to track Blanchefleur from her Grace's handkerchief? That's the end of chapter 12. A beggar's turtle. Yeah. You know, the one that made him stand on his hind legs till he fell over. Alright, 2 more chapters, guys. Left of part 2. I think this is the best time I've ever made. I hope I'm not reading too fast. I think these chapters are just shorter, but if I'm reading way too fast, please let me know. And stop me, because I feel like I'm probably reading too fast. It is a talented turtle. I want one of those. Oh, thanks, Riddy. Chapter the 13th. The idea opened my eyes wide, straightened my spine, and so ardently surged my hope and excitement that they seemed to pass through the reins as if via telegraph lines. Apparently receiving a message, the good Brownie elevated his head, snorted, and plunged forward, forcing the cab through a space I would have thought too small for it. A moment later we detoured into a service drive that led into a twisting maze of back courts and alleyways, from which we eventually emerged near Marylebone Garden. Marylebone. Invigorated, I sent the noble Brownie past an omnibus and straight down Baker Street, achieving a lovely trot. Cab! The imperious voice affected my heart so strangely that instantly I halted Brownie, although it would have been far safer to drive on. Senseless, reckless obedience. I dared not look at the man who had spoken, for he must not notice my face. But as I bent to pull the lever that opened the cab doors, I caught a glimpse of his tall, stork-like form, and those of his shorter, stockier companions, as they climbed in. Sherlock Holmes, Mycroft Holmes, and Dr. Watson. They all squeezed in somehow. I opened the sliding door on the roof of the hansom and said, in the deepest, cruffiest Cockney voice in my repertoire, "Our fare more for the extra weight." Agreed. Take us to Oakley Street, my brother replied. Ah, almost certainly they were going to see Duque Louise Orlando del Campo. Sir, I acknowledged in the same deep voice, sliding shut the opening above his head, but not quite. I hoped to eavesdrop. But confound the din of the city in general, and in particular the rumble of my own cab's metal wheels upon the cobblestones. I could overhear nothing, except once when Sherlock raised his voice. An experiment, Mycroft! The merest experiment! I thought the old collie might be able to locate our daring and elusive sister. I had to go down to Ferndale anyway for this. This, I concluded from their exclamations, was the brown paper embellished with charcoal symbols. Apparently he did not wish to tell them that Reginald Colley had indeed found me, and that he, Sherlock the great detective, had then lost me again. So he had diverted their attention by producing this from his valise. Can either of you make anything of it? Watson's reply was unintelligible, but Mycroft's pompous tone struck my ear quite clearly as he excitedly lectured. Why, my dear fellow, is it not obvious? You have your specialties, but you have not read as broadly in anthropology as I, or you would know. These borders and the encirclement are protective, intended to ward off evil. Something has frightened the sender, causing them to make these designs. And the eyes? Very similar to the Egyptian eye of Horus, or the Hindu third eye. For goodness sake, my dear man, Watson broke in, quite audible this time, this is England, and the 19th century. Yes, and Lady promenade with hems of their skirts and sleeves bordered with the fol de rol that has no practical purpose. Decorative! Except that since aboriginal times, all openings in a garment need to be barricaded with magical symbols to prevent the entry of evil spirits. Mycroft then evidently turned on Sherlock, for he demanded, "Who sent you this?" But my brother's reply was muted, and strain my ears as I might, I could not tell what he said about Ferndale, or Mum, or me, except that Mycroft once roared, "The extraordinary nerve of the girl!" Yes, the nerve indeed, I thought wryly. He and Sherlock had no idea how nervous I was. Indeed, my nerve was stretched to the breaking point over the crowns of their top hats, as Brownie trotted on valiantly with his heavy loaded cab. The nearer to the embankment, the worse the noise, and the denser the traffic, until, reaching the Strand, my cab was barely able to crawl along. As my fare made no complaint, I made no attempt to force a way through the crush, but walked the horse until, nearing the Charing Cross station, we halted, for it seemed that every vehicle in London had come together there. All rumble of wheels had temporarily abated, and though there was still a good deal of commotion, such as some wagon drivers ahead of me cursing one another, still I took the chance to try and hear once again what was going on inside my hansom, inching the opening on the roof a bit more widely ajar. Why on earth no ransom note? Ah, now they spoke of the missing Duchessa, and Watson had resumed his usual puzzled tone. Sorry, that was Watson, not Mycroft. Many possible reasons, replied my brother Sherlock crisply, but none of them hopeful. For instance, assuming that she was kidnapped for money, her captors simply lost their nerve, fearing that she would set the police on them, dispatched her. My dear Holmes, surely! Alas, nothing is sure. Indeed, they might have taken her. The presence of the old woman suggests a procuress, if she was taken for the upper-class trade in the world's oldest profession. A fate worse than death, declared Mycroft. Quite. Watson protested. But surely all conjecture need not be so grim. Is there not a possibility? The good doctor hesitated. Ah, you are thinking of my own peculiar family situation, Sherlock guessed whimsically, and apparently rightly. You hypothesize that the lady may have run away of her own free will? Sounding a bit red-faced, Watson mumbled, Well, surely it is a possibility. Possible, yes, but not probable. Any woman might well wish to escape such an explosively melodramatic husband. Ever the stoic British soldier, Watson, interrupted Sherlock with amusement, to find fault with a perfectly presentable and quite wealthy foreigner. Well, the wife is British, is she not? And French, put in Mycroft, on her mother's side. Very well, persisted poor Watson, partly French and young, and very possibly unhappy with an older husband. Watson, whatever the circumstances, women simply do not run off on a regular basis. Sherlock was beginning to sound a bit peevish, with only 2 unfortunate exceptions that I know of. In tones of sincere apology, Watson cried, Certainly I would not allude to your personal misfortune. Something cleared out of the way far ahead, traffic began to move again, and I trailed the tip of my... Something cleared out of the way far ahead, traffic began to move again. I trailed the tip of my whip over Brownie's back to signal him to walk, and after that I heard no more until I actually turned into Oakley Street and stopped the cab, remembering just in time that, in my guise as a cab driver, I did not know the exact address. I opened the door in the roof, my brother's hand shot up to give me a generous fare and waved dismissively to indicate that he did not expect change, and he, Mycroft, and Watson pushed the hansom doors open before I had put the money away, just as well as I had forgotten to ply the lever. What course of action will you advise for the Duke? Watson was asking as they got out. Duquet, Sherlock corrected him, with a hint of the sneer. Watson was not, after all, alone in his prejudice against the foreigner. Well, perhaps I shall suggest that his wife ran away upon the Underground and is living with my sister. Come now, Holmes, are you truly so at a loss? My informants tell me nothing. Thread after thread of conjecture leads me nowhere. I should never have taken the case, Holmes said bitterly as they walked towards the startlingly Moorish house, a small distance up the street. Missing persons are my Achilles' heel, apparently. Nonsense. 12 times you have come within inches of finding your sister. Make that 12 plus 1, I thought as I turned the cab around and drove away, my heart aching. I admit it. The mere sound of my brother's voice moved me nearly to tears, especially as he spoke so bitterly of me. But it was not to be helped, and I had work to do. It's the end of chapter 13. One more chapter. We're going to press on. Chapter the 14th. After returning Brownie to his humble stable and the cabbie's jacket, and Derby to their proper owner, thanking the man effusively and sincerely, I restored myself as best I could to my former dotted Swissness, complete with hat and wig, pocketed my ring, not that it mattered if I lost it, I had several spare wedding bands on hand. I made my way back to my lodging for a wash and a change of clothing, feeling myself much sullied by paw prints of dog and odor of horse. Also, I needed dinner before I could act upon my plans to find the Duchessa, and the first thing I encountered upon unbuttoning my much-abused dress was a mass of paper cut and pasted into strips. Mum's message. Oh dear. Much as I would have liked to put it off, I knew I would not be able to face Sherlock again until I had dealt with the Skytail. And I needed to face Sherlock in order to enlist the services of Reginald Colley. This very evening, if possible. Standing in my petticoats whilst waiting for the girl to bring up hot water for my ablutions. There's another word for you guys. Sorry, I lost my spot. There we go. I straightened out the strips of paper. There were no less than 4 of them, and all rather long, then laid them on my bed and peered at them, trying to think. Mum had wrapped them around some cylinder to write them, and no doubt she had supposed that the same type and size of cylinder would be available to me. But what could it be, when she was with the Gypsies and I was in London? Nothing small, surely, had given the width of papers. Nothing small, surely, given the width of the papers. Not a paintbrush handle, although Mum was quite the artist. What else did Mum like to do? Looking for wildflowers, wander the countryside. A walking staff? But surely she could not expect me to have one of those in London. Ah, what would she expect me to have that she also had? I must think with Mum's point of view. No small task, as I had never fully understood my mother, but I tried. What had Mum and I done together? Read books? Yes, indeed, but no cylindrical book came to mind. Gathered flowers and arranged them? Surely, but the vases were of various sizes and shapes. No other such activities, such as putting together baskets and bird cages out of sticks? Not Mum. No homebody she. Much preferring to be out of doors, she had made sure I was provided with a swing. She had encouraged me to climb trees, she had taught me to ride a bicycle. The girl chose that moment to knock and enter with the requisite ewer of steaming water, interrupting my thoughts. After my wash, I experimented with wrapping one section of the Skytail around the stem of a floor lamp, shifting the paper this way and that, to no avail. Then I tried my reading lamp. Then one of the railings along the stairway, with no better results. I could not even tell whether I needed larger cylinders or smaller. Most frustrating. I went to see Sherlock after dinner, and in order to tweak his ever so superior nose, I wore exactly the same costume I had worn the day he had failed to recognize me face to face in Mrs. Watson's parlor. No gold ring, as I was being Mrs. Viola Everso. From my polished button-top boots and my modest but lovely primrose yellow frock, to my rice-powdered face with its little birthmark, my carefully coiffed wig, and my gypsy bonnet. How ironic, but that is what they are called, the little flat straw hats with a sprig of flowers. In every particular I was his sister, disguised simply by being beautiful. Rather petty of me, but like my brother I quite liked a moment of triumph. In a carpet bag I carried other clothing more suitable for the night's work that lay ahead of us. That is to say, I quite hoped he would come along. If not, then the night's work lay ahead of me, singularly Enola, as usual. If Sherlock were not at home, I had decided, I would wait. But even though the sun had not yet set this long July evening, I rather expected he would be in his lodging recovering from a tiring and frustrating day. Mrs. Hudson, answering the door, affirmed that he was at home. I sent my card up on a silver tray. Miss Viola Everso. Shortly I heard his rather explosive vocal reaction. Evidently, Mrs. Watson, on the occasion of our previous meeting in her parlor, had told him my name, and he remembered it. A moment later, joyously barking, Reginald Colley came bounding downstairs to greet me. Just in time, before he could leap upon me, I caught the dog by his front paws. "You are not to ruin this dress," I told him affectionately, "or at least not until Sherlock has had the chance to see it." "I see it," said a terse voice from the top of the stairs, as if my personal pulchritude bore no further discussion. My brother changed the subject. "Have you yet read our mother's message?" Climbing the stairs to meet him, trying not to smile too broadly, I waited until I reached his level to speak. Then I said, "I have attempted to do so without success, but never mind that for now, there are more urgent businesses at hand. What could be— I have discovered what happened to the Duchessa del Campo, and I know where we might find her." His eyebrows reacted to the news, I thought, until he said, "We?" "Reginald and I, actually, but certainly you may come along if you like." Sherlock took a deep breath and let it out before he spoke. "I shall let that pass, and I admit that whilst I have quite mastered my studies of the criminal mind, I struggle continually for the slightest comprehension of yours. Here you are, as bold as brass, yet why did you run from me so precipitously?" Yeah, they split the word again. "Earlier today. Surely it is obvious, because I had urgent business elsewhere, and I knew you would desire to detain me." "Indeed." After pursuing me for a moment as if I were a specimen, he said, after perusing me for a moment as if I were a specimen, he said, "I have quite changed my mind, Enola, about your future. I pity any man who ever marries you. Indeed, I think perhaps you ought not to marry." An odd tangent, I thought, but it did not disturb me, for I quite agreed with him. Come in," he added impatiently, waving me into his lodging and tossing some newspapers aside to offer me a seat. I would like to study at university, actually," I confided, whilst daintily I arranged my skirt around me, and Reginald lay down at my feet. "The Renaissance, the German classics, logic, argumentation." With a pained look, as if he were developing a headache, my brother interrupted. "You promised news of the Duchessa del Campo?" "Quite. I have been on the trail of the hag who lured her into the underground. Although there are perhaps hundreds of bulbous women with bristly chins and ugly bonnets in London, I happen to know of a particularly unsavory one, and I focused my attention on her." Concisely, without divulging the means by which I had gone there, I told my brother about my visit to Mrs. Culhane's shop, and what I had found: Blanchefleur's gown, her parasol, her petticoats. "You are quite sure they were the Duchessa's?" Only a man could have asked such a silly question. Or perhaps I should say only a gentleman, because males of the upper classes, dressing alike as they all do, even now, in the comfortable disarray of his lodging, I found my brother uniformed in city attire, complete with a charcoal waistcoat, black jacket, impeccably starched white cuffs and collar, resembling so many penguins, perhaps men of Sherlock's class find it impossible to tell one black frock coat from another. Therefore I answered gently, "My dear brother, dresses are as distinctive to me as cigar ashes are to you. I am completely certain." "Could you not bring something away as proof?" "I could, and I did." From my bosom I produced a fine linen handkerchief edged with a Venetian lace, handing it to him. "I saw several just like this in Lady Blanchefleur's boudoir. You will notice where her monogram has been picked out." "Quite. DDC, Duchessa del Campo." Evidently struggling to adjust his thinking on the matter, he muttered, "It appears, however unlikely. But why on earth would the villains choose this particular lady amongst all the overdressed women in London?" The answer sprang from me before I realized I knew it. For the sake of her exceptionally long and luxuriant golden auburn hair. My brother stared at me as if I were speaking Swahili, but a chill in my bones assured me I was right. The villains had not only taken Blanchefleur's clothing, but had also shorn her head, very likely doubling their profits. You have bought wigs," I said to Sherlock. "You know how expensive they are. I shudder to tell you what I paid for the one I wear, for the hair must be imported from Bavarian peasant girls who wear headkerchiefs, or else be taken from female convicts, few of whom seem likely to have lovely tresses, or sold by women so desperate they agree to part with their crowning glory. In short," Sherlock cut in, "attractive hair for wigs." "And hair extensions and the like," I put in, "is hard to come by and fetches a handsome price." "Quite." "I suppose you may be right," he admitted without enthusiasm. "So, hypothesizing that this Mrs. Culhane and some accomplices seized the Lady Blanchefleur for the sake of her apparel plus her hair, is this shop in a very bad neighborhood?" "Rather." "Some further assault or injury might have made it impossible for her to return home." "Such would seem to be the case." He sprang from his chair, pacing, the man of action. We must arouse the constabulary at once. My plan, I said rather loudly, is to have Reginald Colley attempt to track her from the scent on her handkerchief. At the mention of his name, the aged dog rose to his feet and deployed his ears. I went on. You have perhaps noticed that the Duchessa left some nasal, effulgence upon the cloth? Yes, my dears. Yes, but my dear sister, Reginald is a collie, not a bloodhound. Reginald's liquid brown gaze shifted from me to my brother and back again as he followed the argument. True, I admitted, but immediately a better thought came to me. What about that dog you used to track the Solomon Islander, then? The dog you got from the old fellow who keeps badgers and stoats and so forth? Sherlock halted to peer at me in evident shock. You have been reading Watson's infernally melodramatic accounts of my affairs? Of course. If you consider the sign of the four infernally melodramatic, I believe the dog's name was Toby. Indeed, it was, and still is. Staring down upon me in a most peculiar manner, Sherlock asked an absurdly irrelevant question. Enola, were you serious when you mentioned a desire to go to university? My classical education is good, but I have dreamt of learning higher mathematics, modern literature, sciences such as chemistry. Sherlock raised both hands in quite a decisive gesture, rather like that of an orchestra director commanding silence before the symphony. We will go immediately to fetch Toby, and I will come with you wherever you lead me, on one condition. Mycroft shall also accompany us. That's the end of chapter 14. Hello, Toby. Not to be confused with Toby. I have heard that too. Really, I've heard that phrase too. Mole hags. Not the hair. Welcome, welcome. Yup. So that's the end of part 2, guys, ladies and gents. Yeah, I don't know what your typing's doing, Tori. It's going nutso. So I think, well, it's 8 o'clock. I feel like I could probably finish this book in another hour. So it's really up to you guys. I know you guys probably have plans tonight, but if you want, I can go ahead and finish this book. Or if you want to call it, I can save it for another time. I'm flexible. So I'll let you guys decide. But that's the end of part 2. We just finished. Sorry you missed it, Tori. But you can rewatch it. It's not that hard. So it's up to you guys. So let me know what you think. If you're busy, got some plans set, then let me know. Still at work for another hour. God, I forget you're like hours behind. Like, so. Alrighty. Well, let's see. I think I'll end the stream now and figure it out. Just in case. I'm not sure when my parents are going to be coming home. So we'll kind of go from there. But, so I'll go ahead and end the stream now. And then, because if I start again, I want to stop it up again. Or if I start again tonight, I'll want to start it as a brand new stream. So, but I'll call it for now. I'll see you guys later. Maybe later this evening or maybe sometime later this week. But actually, probably later this week. I might just, you know what? I think I'm going to hang this off. Yeah, I think I am going to stream in the morning. Yeah. So, if you're able to come back tomorrow morning, I'm going to get some stuff done. I can go ahead and do some homework tonight and then not have to do it in the morning. So, I will see you guys then. Thanks for being here. I appreciate you guys. Thanks for supporting me. Thanks for lurking. Like, it's totally cool. I'm glad you're able to get some other stuff done while you're lurking. And I will catch you guys soon. Have a good night.